The first gunshot of the night split the air like thunder, silencing the raucous laughter inside Broken Spoke Saloon as Sarah Mitchell struggled against the ropes binding her wrists. Dust and desperation clung to her travel-worn dress, once a respectable shade of blue, now stained with the grime of a 3-day journey in the back of a bounty hunter's wagon. It was 1878, and in the lawless frontier town of Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, human lives were just another commodity to be traded. $500 for this one, gentlemen, drawled Hank Jessup, the bounty hunter who'd captured her outside of Cheyenne. His calloused hand gripped her arm as he paraded her before the crowd of miners, gamblers, and drifters. Educated woman can read and write, good breeding stock too. His fingers dug painfully into her flesh as he forced her to turn in a circle. Sarah bit back tears of rage. 3 weeks ago, she'd been teaching at her respectable school in St. Louis. Now, falsely accused of theft by a spurned suitor with connections to the local judge, she'd been sentenced to rehabilitation through labor, a thinly veiled sentence of servitude that had seen her transported west and into the hands of Jessup, who had his own plans for profit. "This is illegal," she hissed between clenched teeth. "I am a free woman, not property to be sold." Jessup's laugh was like gravel. "Ain't nothing illegal out here, darlin'. Your papers say you're bound for service, and I'm just finding you a suitable employer." He turned to the crowd. "Who'll start the bidding?" The saloon owner, a portly man with a waxed mustache, raised a finger. 200. 300, countered a grizzled miner, eyes glassy with whiskey and lust. Sarah's stomach turned as the bids climbed. The faces before her blurred into a nightmare of leering expressions and calculating stares. This couldn't be happening in America, not in 1878. She'd heard stories of indentured servitude and worse in the territories, but never imagined she'd face such a fate. At the back of the room, a figure stood silently, hat pulled low over his features. He'd been nursing the same whiskey for hours, watching everything while seeming to watch nothing. As the bidding reached $450, Jessup grew impatient. "Come on, boys, she's worth twice that. Look at her, barely 22 and unspoiled. We'll seal the deal at midnight. Meanwhile, who wants a closer look?" Several men surged forward, hands reaching. Sarah recoiled, but there was nowhere to retreat. A large hand clamped onto her shoulder and she twisted, ready to fight despite her bonds. The clock on the wall showed 15 minutes to midnight when the back door swung open, bringing with it a gust of night air and the tall, imposing silhouette of a man Sarah hadn't seen before. Bradford Lockhart stood framed in the doorway, trail dust coating his long coat, his eyes taking in the scene with the measured calculation of a man accustomed to weighing life and death decisions. At 32, he wore his years in the fine lines around his eyes and the permanent furrow between his brows. The Winchester rifle in his hand spoke volumes about his readiness for trouble. "What's the commotion about?" he asked, voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly hushed room. Jessup puffed up his chest. "Private business transaction, stranger. Nothing that concerns you." Brad's gaze settled on Sarah, noting the ropes around her wrists, the fear and defiance warring in her eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Something shifted in his expression. "Looks like you're selling what isn't yours to sell," he said, stepping fully into the saloon. "She's mine, legal and proper," Jessup countered, producing a folded document from his jacket. "Court order for rehabilitation." "I'm just helping find her a suitable place." Bradford crossed the room in measured strides, boots striking the wooden floor with deliberate impact. He took the paper, scanned it, then handed it back with a look of disgust. "That's not a slave warrant. It's a work order for a state facility." His voice remained even but ice-edged each word. "Last I checked, you're not the Wyoming Territorial Prison." Jessup's hand inched toward the gun at his hip. "Paper's paper, no law here to say otherwise." "There's me," Brad said simply. The bounty hunter's laugh was ugly. "You aim to buy her yourself. Biddings at $475. The clock struck midnight with a hollow chime. In the sudden silence that followed, Bradford Lockhart raised his Winchester, pointing it directly at Jessup's chest. "No," he said. "I aim to trade for her." Jessup's eyes narrowed. "That old rifle ain't worth more than $40. It's worth your life," Brad replied softly. "Which is what it'll cost you if you don't cut her loose right now." The saloon had gone deathly quiet. Even the piano player had stilled his fingers on the keys. Sarah stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the two men faced off. "You can't just," Jessup began. Bradford chambered around with an ominous click. "She's mine," he said with quiet finality. "Unless you'd rather argue the point further." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, perhaps, or the calm readiness to follow through made Jessup hesitate. His eyes darted around the room, seeking allies, but found none willing to die for his cause. "Fine," he spat, drawing a knife and slicing through Sarah's bonds with unnecessary roughness. "Take the troublesome bitch, she ain't worth dying over." Bradford kept the rifle trained steadily. "Now her papers." With a curse, Jessup tossed the document at Brad's feet. "Get out," Brad told him. "Ride until morning and don't look back." The bounty hunter backed toward the door, fury etched in every line of his face. "This ain't over," he promised. "It is for tonight," Bradford replied. When Jessup had slammed out of the saloon, Brad finally lowered his rifle and approached Sarah, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. Sarah rubbed her chafed wrists, studying him with wary eyes. "No more than my pride," she hesitated. "Why did you help me?" He stooped to retrieve the papers, handing them to her without looking at them further. "Because what he was doing wasn't right." A simple answer delivered without flourish. The saloon had begun to buzz with conversation again, though many eyes still watched them with interest. "You should know," Brad continued quietly. "Those papers don't make you mine or anyone's, but folks around here might not see it that way for a while. You'd be safer if—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If they thought I belonged to you," Sarah finished for him, bitterness edging her tone. Brad shook his head. "If they thought you were under my protection, there's a difference." Something in his sincerity made her consider him more carefully. He wasn't what she'd expect from a frontier gunman. There was an intelligence in his gaze, a controlled stillness that spoke of strength rather than violence. "What do you want in return?" she asked bluntly. A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Nothing, madam. But I own a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town. You'd be welcome to stay there until you decide what you want to do next. My housekeeper, Mrs. Oakes, would be proper company." Sarah weighed her limited options. She was alone in a town where at least a dozen men had just bid on her like cattle. She had no money, no friends, and a court order that could be misused against her again. "I can cook and clean," she said finally. "And I'm educated. I could help with accounts or correspondence. I won't be a charity case." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I could use the help. Ranch keeping doesn't leave much time for ledgers." He offered his hand, not to take hers, but to seal their agreement. Sarah looked at it for a long moment before accepting, feeling the rough calluses of hard work against her palm. "Bradford Lockhart," he introduced himself properly. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied. "Former teacher from St. Louis, current fugitive from injustice." This time his smile reached his eyes. "Let's get you out of here, Miss Mitchell. Dawn comes early on a ranch." As they stepped out into the cool night air, Sarah felt the weight of many eyes following them. She knew this was far from over, but for the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The journey to Bradford's ranch passed in relative silence. He'd procured a horse for Sarah from the livery, paying with actual money rather than threats, and led the way out of town along a moonlit trail that wound through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and the occasional pine. Bradford's ranch was modest by Wyoming standards, a sturdy 2-story cabin with a wide porch, a barn, corral, and a few outbuildings clustered against the backdrop of distant mountains. As they approached, a lamp flickered to life in one of the windows. "Mrs. Oaks never sleeps until everyone's home safe, Brad explained, dismounting and helping Sarah from her horse. The housekeeper proved to be a diminutive woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. To Sarah's surprise, she accepted Brad's brief explanation without question, merely nodding and showing Sarah to a small but clean bedroom on the second floor. "Breakfast is at 6, the older woman informed her. "Mr. Lockhart rises earlier, but you needn't trouble yourself until then." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashing over her in a wave of delayed shock. She buried her face in her hands and allowed herself precisely 3 minutes of silent tears before straightening her shoulders. She would not be broken by this ordeal. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up the stairs. Sarah had slept fitfully, waking at every unfamiliar sound, but she dressed quickly in the same travel-worn clothes and made her way downstairs. Bradford sat at the kitchen table, bent over what appeared to be a ledger. He rose when she entered, offering a nod of greeting. "Mrs. Oaks makes the best flapjacks in the territory," he said by way of good morning. The housekeeper harumphed but placed a generous stack before Sarah. "Eat, child. You're nothing but skin and bones." Over breakfast, Brad outlined the workings of the ranch. He ran a modest herd of cattle with the help of 2 hired hands who lived in the bunkhouse, Jose Ramirez and Thomas Whitehorse, a Cheyenne man who'd been with Brad since the ranch's beginning 5 years earlier. "What brought you to Wyoming territory?" Sarah asked, curious about the man who'd risked his life for a stranger. A shadow crossed his face. "The war left little for me back east." Which war, she wondered. The Civil War ended 13 years ago, but the scars it left were still tender on the nation. She didn't press. "I taught history and literature in St. Louis," she offered instead. "Until a judge's son decided my rejection of his advances was an insult requiring retaliation." Brad's jaw tightened. "The charge, theft of school funds." "Entirely fabricated, but his father ensured no one questioned the evidence." He nodded slowly. "There's no schoolhouse in these parts yet, nearest one's in Laramie, but there are families scattered about who might value lessons for their children." Sarah felt a spark of interest. "You think I could teach here?" "I think you can do whatever you set your mind to, Miss Mitchell." The simple vote of confidence, delivered without flattery or condescension, warmed her more than she expected. The next few days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. True to her word, Sarah took over the household accounts, discovering a surprising aptitude for ranching economics in the process. Bradford's books had been meticulously kept, but not optimally organized. She implemented a new system that clearly showed which aspects of the operation were profitable and which needed attention. "You've saved me 3 hours of squinting at numbers," Brad commented when she presented the revised ledgers. "Where did you learn this?" "My father was an accountant," she explained. "He believed daughters should be as educated as sons." Something like admiration flickered in Brad's eyes. "A progressive man." "He was," she agreed, the familiar pang of grief softened by good memories. "He died during the cholera outbreak of '73. They were interrupted by the arrival of Jose and Thomas, bringing news that fence repairs on the north boundary were complete, but that they'd spotted unfamiliar tracks crossing Lockhart land. "Could be nothing," Thomas said, his dark eyes serious beneath the brim of his hat. "Could be rustlers testing boundaries." Bradford nodded. "Double the night watch for the next week. I'll ride out with you tomorrow to check the West Range." Sarah noted how the men deferred to Brad without hesitation, not from fear, but from a clear respect that he had earned through actions rather than demands. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Oaks with dinner preparations, Sarah found herself watching Bradford through the window as he worked in the corral with a young colt. His patience with the nervous animal, the gentle but firm way he guided it through simple commands, spoke volumes about his character. "He's a good man, Mrs. Oaks commented, catching Sarah's gaze. Came out here broken from the war, but this land healed him, mostly anyway. Which side did he fight for? Sarah asked cautiously. The older woman gave her a shrewd look. Does it matter? Sarah considered the question honestly. No, she decided. I suppose it doesn't. Not anymore. Days turned to weeks, and Sarah found herself settling into life at the Lockhart ranch with surprising ease. She started teaching the Ramirez children and 2 youngsters from a neighboring homestead 3 afternoons a week. Brad converted a corner of the barn into a makeshift schoolroom, complete with a blackboard he'd ridden all the way to Laramie to purchase. The physical distance between Sarah and Bradford remained respectful, but she increasingly found herself aware of his presence, the sound of his voice giving instructions to the hands, the cadence of his footsteps on the porch, the way his rare smile transformed his face from handsome to breathtaking. It was during the first autumn storm, with rain lashing the windows and wind howling through the eaves, that their carefully maintained boundaries began to blur. Sarah was in the sitting room, reading by lamplight when Bradford entered, soaked to the skin from checking on a mare about to foal. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, setting aside her book and hurrying to stoke the fire. He shrugged off his dripping coat. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been wet and cold." "That doesn't make it sensible to tempt fate again," Sarah countered, handing him a blanket from the chest by the hearth. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a simple touch that sent a current of awareness through her. For a moment, neither moved, caught in an unspoken acknowledgement of something growing between them. Brad broke the silence first. "I received word from the marshal in Laramie today. Jessup's been seen in the area." Sarah's momentary warmth vanished. "He's coming for me." "More likely for me," Brad said grimly. "Men like that don't take kindly to public humiliation." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I've brought trouble to your door." "Trouble finds its way to every door eventually," he replied, his voice gentler than his words. "But you should be careful. Don't ride out alone until we know he's moved on." That night, Sarah dreamed of the saloon again, but this time there was no Bradford Lockhart stepping through the door to save her. She woke with a gasp, sheets twisted around her legs, heart hammering against her ribs. A noise from downstairs pulled her fully awake. Carefully, she crept to her door and listened. Voices low, angry, the crash of something breaking. Without thinking, she grabbed the small derringer Brad had insisted she keep in her nightstand and made her way toward the sounds. The scene in the kitchen froze her in place. Bradford stood with his back to the wall, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Across from him, Jessup and another man Sarah didn't recognize had their guns drawn. "Thought you were smarter than to come back alone," Jessup was saying. Brad's eyes flicked to where Sarah stood in the doorway and back so quickly she almost missed it. "I thought you were smarter than to trespass on my land." Jessup's laugh was ugly. "Your land? This will be my land once you're dead, and your woman will fetch a fine price down in Colorado." "She's not property," Brad said, his voice deadly quiet. "Everything's property to someone with enough power to take it," Jessup replied, raising his gun. Sarah didn't consciously decide to fire the derringer. One moment she was frozen in terror, the next, the small gun was exploding in her hand, the sound deafening in the confined space. Her shot went wide, but the distraction was enough. Brad lunged forward, tackling Jessup as the bounty hunter's shot buried itself in the ceiling. The second man turned toward Sarah, his expression murderous. She backed away, the derringer useless now with its single spent chamber. From the floor, Brad and Jessup wrestled for control of Jessup's revolver. It discharged with a thunderous report, and the second intruder crumpled, a look of surprise on his face as he fell. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, watching in horror as Brad finally gained the upper hand, pinning Jessup to the floor with a forearm across his throat. "Give me one reason not to end you right now," he growled. Jessup's face was purpling from the pressure. "You're not a killer," he choked out. Something dark passed across Bradford's features. "You're wrong about that." But after a moment of visible struggle, he eased the pressure slightly. "But I won't become a murderer for the likes of you." Mrs. Oakes appeared in the doorway, a shotgun in her hands. "Jose and Thomas are coming from the bunkhouse," she reported calmly, as if midnight invasions were commonplace. I fired the warning shot. Within minutes, the two ranch hands had helped secure Jessup. The second intruder, who turned out to be merely wounded rather than killed, was also bound. "Take them to the sheriff in Redemption Creek," Brad instructed. "Tell him they broke in armed and with stated intent to kill me and abduct Miss Mitchell." Only when the men had been taken away did Bradford finally slump into a chair, allowing Sarah to clean the cut on his forehead. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "That shot gave me the chance I needed." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pressed a clean cloth to the wound. "I was terrified I'd hit you instead. You have good instincts." His eyes held hers. "But I wish you'd stayed upstairs safe and let you die." She shook her head fiercely. "I couldn't do that." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that whatever had been growing between them had deepened into something neither could ignore any longer. "Sarah," he began, his voice rougher than usual. She silenced him by leaning forward and pressing her lips gently to his. It was a kiss born of relief and fear, and something much more profound that she wasn't ready to name. To her surprise and pleasure, Bradford responded immediately, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite tenderness. When they parted, his eyes searched hers. "I never expected you," he said simply. Sarah smiled, her heart lighter despite the night's violence. "Nor I you. The incident with Jessup changed things at the Lockhart ranch." The bounty hunter and his accomplice were sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. But more importantly, the sheriff had examined Sarah's papers and declared them a clear case of judicial overreach, writing to the authorities in St. Louis to have the charges properly investigated. As winter settled over the Wyoming landscape, Sarah's temporary refuge began to feel increasingly like home. Her small school had grown to 8 students, with parents paying in everything from eggs and butter to promises of help with the spring branding. Bradford, for his part, found increasingly transparent reasons to be wherever Sarah happened to be working, checking fence lines near where she was gathering wildflowers, inspecting the barn roof while she taught her lessons below, lingering over breakfast until she finished her coffee. Their courtship unfolded with the steady, unhurried pace of people who understood that good things were worth building carefully. Brad taught Sarah to ride Western style and shoot more accurately. She introduced him to Shakespeare and Whitman, reading aloud by firelight during the long winter evenings. It was during one such evening, with snow falling thick outside the windows and the house quiet except for the crackling fire, that Bradford finally spoke of his past. "I fought for the Union," he said abruptly, interrupting her reading of Song of Myself. "Enlisted when I was 18, fought until Appomattox." Sarah set the book aside, recognizing the importance of this confidence. "You don't have to tell me if it pains you," he shook his head. "I want you to know, I was a scout mainly because I could move quietly and had good eyes. Saw things no young man should see." His gaze was fixed on the fire. "After the war, I couldn't go home to Pennsylvania. Everything felt wrong, too small, too unchanged when I had changed so much." Sarah moved to sit beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could reach for her if he wanted. "I drifted west," Brad continued. "Worked cattle drives, broke horses, took odd jobs. Fought Indians until I realized we were just repeating the same mistakes of the war, brother killing brother over land and ideas." He looked at her directly now. "I'm not proud of everything I've done, but I've tried to build something good here." "You have," Sarah said softly. "Anyone can see that." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "When I saw you in that saloon, something woke up in me that I thought had died long ago. The certainty that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Not just of Jessup and what might happen, but of feeling helpless again. Of losing control of my own life." Brad's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "You're the strongest person I know, Sarah Mitchell. You could have broken under what happened to you, but instead, you built a new life." "We built it together," she corrected gently. The kiss they shared then was different from their first, not born of adrenaline and relief, but of deep understanding and growing love. When Bradford drew back, his eyes held a question. "I received a letter yesterday," he said, "from the court in St. Louis. The charges against you have been dropped. The judge's son confessed to framing you after his father's sudden death made him reconsider his actions." Sarah's heart raced. "I'm free to go home." "Yes." A shadow crossed his face. "If that's what you want." She studied him for a long moment, this man who had risked everything for a stranger, who had given her space to heal and grow, who looked at her now as if she held his heart in her hands. "This is my home now," she said firmly. "If you want me to stay." The tension in his shoulders eased. "I want much more than that, Sarah. I want forever if you'll have me." They were married in the spring, when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the green pastures. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by neighbors, students, and even the sheriff who had helped clear Sarah's name. As Bradford slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from terror in a saloon to profound happiness on a Wyoming ranch. "I never believed in fate," Bradford confessed that night as they sat on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "But how else can I explain finding you exactly when I did?" Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days of false imprisonment. "Perhaps some stories are written in the stars long before we understand them," she suggested. "Or perhaps good people make their own destiny by choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier." Bradford's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Either way, I'm grateful. When I said she's mine that night, I never dreamed that one day I'd be yours just as completely." Sarah smiled, turning her face up to his. "That's the difference," she said softly. "What Jessup wanted was possession. What we have is belonging to each other by choice every day." As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, their kiss sealed a promise that had begun in a moment of courage and grown into a lifetime of love. Not a story of ownership, but of two people who had found in each other the freedom to be fully themselves together. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Bradford would wink at Sarah before telling a somewhat edited version of that night in Redemption Creek. The story changed a little with each telling, but the heart of it remained the same in a world where too many saw people as property to be bought and sold. True love recognized the priceless worth of a human soul and would risk everything to protect it. And in the ledger Bradford kept of the ranch's most important transactions, there remained a simple entry that made Sarah smile whenever she came across it. 1 Winchester rifle fair trade for everything that matters.